additional challenge in talking about Gandhi, particularly in this age, in the beginning of the 21st century, not just because his reputation has been encrusted in so many different ways from Munna Bhai and so forth. It's in part because of the character of his life and the character of the narratives that we have received about him. In some ways, I sometimes argue that Gandhi's life and thought have become like a big epic, like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana or something. And with those epics, it shares the following features. Like those epics, none of us quite remember when we heard the story for the first time and how many times have we heard it. Like those epics, none of us is quite sure what the exactly correct narrative is. Each time we hear the story, there's a nice nuance or something. Each retelling differs from the previous one. Like epics, the narrative is available for all kinds of uses, from the deeply spiritual and sublime to the gossipy and kitschy, and for advertising purposes, for any kind of purpose, right? And like any powerful epic, somehow the flow of his life and his message seem to overflow any limitations we set upon it, right? Like an epic, perhaps like the Mahabharata, Gandhi's life sustains both a message and its opposite. Was his life a success or a failure? Right? How do we answer that question? Did Dharma triumph in Mahabharata or did it get defeated ultimately? Right? And I think it's important to be reminded of this fact because, I can imagine actually, I think Gandhi ji, wherever he is, looking at us and sort of, smiling as he as he used to. He had an extraordinary sense of humor. Listening to all these discussions and with a twinkle in his eye saying, got you, try and figure out what this is all about. But the fundamental point is it's a life and a structure of thought that defies easy characterization, right? It is arguably the one life in modern India whose each moment is so deliberately composed, so carefully thought out, right, that it remains unhoused in any categories that we actually impose on it. It's a story of experiment, as he described it. It's a story of innovation, struggle, great self-doubt and hesitation. Absolutely extraordinary if you read the last years of Gandhi's own account of his life. Absolutely, self-doubt and hesitation. And so I sometimes wonder sort of, who are we in a position to abridge its message into some kind of soundbite, right? And I think the most important thing about Gandhi is to rescue Gandhi from being an ism. I think the worst thing that happened to Gandhi and Gandhi's thought and life was that it became an ism, and then it was an ism that was appropriated by the Indian state for its own purposes. Right? Now, why am I saying all this as a preface in this conference? I think for one, very important reason, which is as I look at the public culture of India and as I look at the public culture of Indian institutions, whether they're public institutions, private institutions, educational institutions, I think one thing that stands out is that there seem to be too many solutions chasing too many problems, but there's actually very little genuine thinking going on. It's a very presumptuous kind of statement to make. And Gandhiji was nothing if he was not about self-reliance in thinking. The idea that, right, each of us should lead a life, right, or guide our actions by thoughts that are in some senses significantly our own. We can't, in a sense, outsource our thinking to somebody else. Every seminar in Delhi ends with, what's the solution? Think about it, introspect. There are too many models, there are too many solutions out there. And I think part of the deep message that he was trying to send society, which I think is a fundamental of governance across a range of institutions, is that any society that relies too much on the idea that there is independent authority out there that is going to, as it were, create ready-made solutions for you, right? So all we need to do is just, as it were, call up those solutions, dial up those solutions. I think that society is actually going to be in deep trouble. Right? As much as he loved truth and nonviolence, he was a resolute defender of independent thinking and a sense of individuality. And I use the word individuality, not individualism. It's amazing how many times in his writing the word individuality crops up. Right? The fundamental idea that each of us will have to, as it were, define our own relationship to the world in ways that we can actually understand, and not take everything on vicarious trust, as if we were living out somebody else's thought or somebody else's life. And I think that is something, as it were, India desperately needs, as it were, not be caught in by the image of outsourcing our thoughts. The other thing I think that flowed from Gandhi's resolute stress on individuality was his very sort of peculiar idea of public discourse. There are two sort of interesting examples of it. One, I think in one of the Young India pamphlets, there's a little section saying, advice to satyagrahis. And one of the pieces of advice he gives to satyagrahis is, don't criticize people who don't participate in the satyagraha. Absolutely astonishing piece of advice, right? I mean, why? Partly he makes this quite radical argument that in some contexts, or in many contexts, criticism itself can be a form of violence. But the most fundamental thing I think he wanted to, as it were, get across is that if he should have any authority over us, it is not because of any authority that he claims to exercise. It should simply be the power of his example. We should embrace it for our own reasons, not because Gandhi is a great figure whom we need to bow to. Absolutely central to almost everything he did and said. The reverse side of it is, of course, that amusing incident with, Srinivas Shastri, who was one of his most vocal critics, liberal critics, and he used to write these stinging, as it were, criticisms of Gandhiji. And typical Gandhian sort of way of disarming him was, I think it was after one of Gandhiji's fasts, the usual ritual of who'll give him nimbu pani. And of course, he calls for one of his fiercest critics, Srinivas Shastri. So Srinivas Shastri, of course, can't say no, has to come, help Gandhi break his fast. And the poor man is so disarmed after that for 6 months he cannot write anything critical about Gandhi, right? At which point Gandhiji sends Srinivas Shastri a little letter saying, Srinivas, your criticism was soothing, your silence is torturous, right? So that, in a sense, I think it was a sensibility about a certain kind of public culture, about this right balance between authority and criticism, and the space for individuality in it, which I think is something that all organizations need to reflect about. Now, in the remaining 5 to 7 minutes, what I want to do is, I think, touch upon two aspects of Gandhi's thinking. Both of these aspects relate to the kind of public culture that he thought India should have. One of them speaks directly to the kinds of corporate governance that he might have envisioned. But I think both of these are big challenges for contemporary India. The first challenge is, of course, the most obvious and in some senses the most familiar. The idea that in 21st century India, people can still be targeted for simply who they are, right, is an absolute moral abomination. There's just absolutely no other way of describing it. And unfortunately, I think this sensibility is spreading. I hate to say this, but Gandhi's biggest nightmare about India, right, that it is sitting on top of, as it were, a communal tinderbox, unfortunately remains the reality of 21st century India as well. I think Gandhi was the only politician who saw clearly the kind of darkness we were capable of. And I think three things about his diagnosis, I think, bear repeating. They bear repeating simply because they've simply been shrouded in all kinds of obfuscations. The first element of his diagnosis was that when it comes to violence, when it comes to treating other groups in terms of what their identity is and so forth, there have to be absolutely clear Lakshman Rekhas, moral lines drawn, no ifs, no buts. A provocation is never an excuse, right? Extenuating circumstances are never an excuse. And he saw clearly, I mean, over and over after every riot, if you read his letters, whether it's after the Mappila riots or 1941, A politics that is characterized by ifs and buts is a politics of obfuscation and mendacity. Right? There are simply no extenuating circumstances that allow, that permit a society to tolerate the kind of violence that we are witnessing. The second, I think, interesting aspect was he very clearly saw a relationship between an unconditional concept of friendship and the concept of citizenship. Again and again he says, look, there are two views in which you can view relations with other groups. One is as a kind of conditional relationship. You know, there are different communities, different religions, different groups and societies. In a society, what we can do is constantly be aware of how the competition between these groups is working out, right? Okay? And one concept of holding India together is premised on the idea that somehow there has to be parity between all these groups, right? And so each group is looking for, you know, how much injury has been done to the other, right? How much benefit has gone to the other group. It's a conception of politics where every right, every obligation, even the sense of who we mourn for, whose death counts, is mediated by which group you belong to. That is the centrality of Indian politics. Right? Whether it's Congress or BJP, either way it actually doesn't make a difference, to be honest. Both of them share the same premise. Gandhi clearly saw that if you're going to have a conception of a modern conception of citizenship, you won't use the word modern in the sense we use it, emerge in India, the relationship between different individuals in the society has to be one of absolutely unconditional friendship. It's not one which says, I will do this for you if you do following for me. Because what he recognized was that that balancing act is simply a camouflage for disguising what it is that we want, the kind of ill will that we want to bear towards other communities. Right? And so again and again, he uses this concept in relation to the idea of citizenship of friendship. But what does friendship mean? You simply enjoy people's company. You don't ask the question, you know, did you pay for an extra samosa yesterday and did I pay? You know, or did I pay yesterday, right? If you do that constantly, if friendship is about that kind of balancing, of course the social equilibrium will bear down. The third and final aspect of his conception of modern citizenship, which is where I think we need Gandhian figures, is although he's very suspicious of the idea of authority in the sense that I outlined it, his biggest role was to be a credible interlocutor in time of great social division. If you look at our democracy right now, our biggest challenge is going to be the following. You know, it was Gandhi's nightmare, as it was the nightmare of many critics of democracy from Plato onwards, that a democracy will lose its sense of discrimination, right? Every opinion becomes as good as any other, right? And that sense of discrimination, I think, is certainly a challenge. But I think the challenge in our democracy at the moment actually goes even deeper, which is we have gone from the proposition that everybody is entitled to their opinion to the proposition that everybody is also entitled to their own facts. Right? What does this mean? What this means is that effectively, in any situation of division, disagreement, and conflict, there is no common ground by which that dispute can be mediated. Right? Whether it's a communal dispute, you know, the facts of the matter, who did it, right? Everybody has their own narrative. Or if it's more serious, in a sense, economic disputes. I mean, take the simple case about, let's say, environmental governance. Now, of course, in a society like India, there will be deep divisions about the right balance between the environment and development. There's no hiding that fact. But our biggest challenge is that it's not clear what a shared body of facts would be that would allow us to even mediate this dispute rationally. Right? Where we say, look, if you can convince me that, you know, this industrial plant won't have consequences, well, I'm happy to go along with it. Now think of what it means for a society and a corporate culture to work in a function where, in a context where that credible mediation is no longer possible. And I think that Gandhiji saw that breakdown of authority as an imminent possibility in a democracy. The challenge for corporate India is going to be that if the idea of liberal citizenship in India is being corroded in these different kinds of ways. Right? It's a lack of sense of discrimination, an instrumentalism towards other communities, and an erosion of all firm moral boundaries. Can liberal capitalism survive the demise of liberal citizenship and the liberal public sphere? I think it is a question corporate India will need to ask. It cannot avoid that question. The final point I want to make in inclusion, which is the other side of our public culture, and this I say with all due respect to all my economist friends who are here, whenever you go to a discussion of any kind of problem in India, whether it's corporations, whether it's public institutions, whether it's education, the standard solution you get, or at least one element of a standard solution is, you have to get incentives right. Somehow institutions don't work because incentives are misaligned. Incentives or punishment. And to plead guilty, I did an edited volume with a colleague which actually made a lot of the same points. You have to, you can't have a system working on perverse incentives and so forth. But if you think about it deeply, I think Gandhi had one very powerful insight, is that all the talk about a kind of instrumental culture of work is actually self-defeating. Now think of incentives in the following kind of way. Of course, at one level, incentives matter, but I think primarily they matter because it's a collective signal society sends to a particular activity that how much that activity is valued, right? So in that sense, incentives matter. But fundamentally, there is an incompatibility between a culture of incentives and a culture of integrity. Okay? We are under the illusion that incentives can bring about integrity. Right? But I think philosophically, there is a deep incompatibility between the two, which Gandhi saw. And the incompatibility goes as follows, right? Which is, integrity concerns the extent to which any person can demonstrate a certain consistency of character that is rooted in a morally serious commitment to a particular kind of activity, right? And the ends and responsibilities that activity imposes on that person. And these ends and responsibilities are such that, or you feel the weight of them, such that you're not willing to compromise, right, in discharging your duties. What does the language of incentive say? The language of incentive says that the only good reason to engage in an activity is an extrinsic reason, right? If the incentives are right, do it, otherwise don't do it, right? Now the idea that we can bootstrap integrity out of a culture of incentives is just plainly mad. I mean, if there's this one thing that the current US crisis shows you, it's actually just that, right? Which is, unless you have a culture of work and professionalism in whichever organization it is, right, where, in a sense, your vocation sets some bounds on what you're allowed to or not allowed to do, the weight of what you feel you can do and cannot do. Unless you have that sense of vocation, right, no culture of incentives can actually compensate for the onset of a crisis. And if you look at the consistency in Gandhi's thinking, right, whether he's thinking about citizenship, whether it's his critique of capitalism in the sense of a critique of a certain kind of instrumental reason, that the only reason to do something is because of something extrinsic to the activity itself. Why do I teach? Not because I enjoy teaching, but because somebody gave me the right incentives. Right? Why did I become a lawyer? Because somebody gave me the right incentives. Even as an explanatory theory, that's crazy. In fact, as a compliment to all my economist friends, I think most of their lives are actually lives defy the incentive theory that they themselves propound, right? But fundamentally, right, the idea that if the sole motivation in society or the overriding motivation is a culture of incentives, you will be able to produce a culture of integrity is mad. And the consistency in Gandhi's reasoning is a pure culture of instrumentalism, even inside a corporation, is likely to be self-defeating in a serious sense.